Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Today, the Catholic Church is, well, it's this massive geopolitical and spiritual institution.
Right, with over 1.4 billion members worldwide.
Exactly. I mean, it operates its own sovereign nation state, it has a highly organized global hierarchy, and it maintains a diplomatic corps that interacts with almost every government on Earth.
But in 33 CE, it was an illegal underground sect.
Yeah, its members were actively hunted by the authorities of the Roman Empire. So the question is, how does a group hiding in catacombs, passing secret messages and facing execution in gladiatorial arenas, become the most powerful institution in Western history?
That trajectory, going from a marginalized and persecuted fringe movement to the absolute center of global power, is arguably one of the most complex institutional evolutions in human history.
And to understand the modern world, you really have to understand the mechanics of how this specific organization built itself.
Which is why we are diving straight into this material as part of our History of Religion series.
Right, we're focusing on the expansive 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church. And we have an enormous stack of sources on the table today.
We do. We are pulling from detailed theological analyses, extensive historical timelines, and highly specific deep dives into watershed moments, things like the Great Schism, the Protestant Reformation, and the modern Vatican councils.
So the mission for you, the listener, is to trace this continuous thread. We want you to map out how doctrine, political power, and internal reform connect 33 CE to the present day.
We're going to look at the actual machinery of the institution. How did it grow? Why did it repeatedly fracture?
And how did it continually manage to reinvent itself when faced with existential collapse?
Right. And to be absolutely clear right at the outset, we are dealing with historical texts that cover intense theological disputes and, frankly, incredibly violent political conflicts.
Yes, so our commitment to you today is objective reporting. We are going to lay out what the sources say, examining the arguments in the historical record impartially.
We are not taking sides on any of the theological doctrines of the geopolitical matters we discuss.
Exactly. We are here to understand how the engine works, not to argue about who should be driving the car.
Well said. So, if we are going to understand the hierarchy that eventually dictated the next 2 millennia of European history, we have to start at the foundational origin point outlined in the sources.
The 1st century.
Right.
Let's head straight there. The texts begin with the apostolic roots, specifically looking at the era around 33 CE with the ministry of Jesus.
And there are a lot of theological claims made in the 1st century, but the sources point to one highly specific textual moment that becomes the legal and structural bedrock for everything that follows.
We're looking at the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, verses 18 through 19.
This is a critical piece of text for understanding the administrative future of the church.
Okay, what does it actually say?
In this passage, Jesus designates one of his primary followers, Peter, as the rock upon which the church will be built. He tells Peter that he is giving him the keys to the kingdom of heaven.
Right, and you have to look past the theology for a second and look at the institutional implication of that statement.
Exactly. This specific reference establishes the entire basis for what becomes known as papal primacy.
So let's break down the mechanics of papal primacy for the listener. It's not just about Peter being an important historical figure, is it?
No, it's about a concept called apostolic succession.
Because, well, how does a single conversation in the 1st century translate into a man living in a palace in Rome 1,000 years later, wielding absolute power?
Right. Apostolic succession is the mechanism of authority transfer. The idea is that the spiritual authority and the leadership mandate given to Peter and the original apostles didn't just die with them.
It was passed on.
Handed down in a direct, physical, unbroken line to their successors. When an apostle appointed a new leader, a bishop, they laid their hands on them, transferring that authority.
And because Peter is traditionally held to have traveled to Rome and been martyred there,
the bishops of Rome, the popes, claim to be his direct, exclusive inheritors. They claim they hold the keys that were handed to Peter.
Okay, so you have this massive theological claim to ultimate authority. But making a claim in 33 CE and actually running an organization are two very different things.
Completely different. A spiritual claim needs a bureaucracy to enforce it.
And the sources detail what is called the ante-Nicene period, For the listener, ante-Nicene simply means the time before the Council of Nicaea.
Right. And by the year 200 CE, the sources highlight a man named Irenaeus. He was the Bishop of Lyon in modern-day France.
And under his leadership, we see that a basic administrative structure is actually already functioning.
The speed at which this structure formalized is quite notable when you consider the logistical hurdles.
Yeah, I mean, we are talking about a system of regional branches governed absolutely from Rome, functioning across the vast geography of the Mediterranean and Western Europe.
Which is wild because...
Wait, hold on. We are talking about the year 200 CE. Christianity is still an illegal religion at this point.
Very much so. It is sporadically, but violently persecuted by the Roman state.
There's no postal service. There's no secure communication network. If I am the Bishop of Rome, how on earth am I coordinating a cohesive, absolute governance structure with a bishop in Lyon, France, while we are both actively trying to avoid imperial execution?
That is the logistical reality of the early church. It relied on a highly dedicated underground network.
Couriers,
traveling merchants, and a very strong epistolary culture, meaning the writing of dense instructional letters passed secretly from city to city.
And Irenaeus in Lyon was crucial to this.
Yes, because he was actively writing against various splinter groups.
Mm-hmm.
He argued that the only way to maintain the true teachings of Jesus was to adhere strictly to the authority of the bishops.
The bishops who were in communion with Rome.
Exactly. They built an administrative hierarchy, not out of brick and mortar, but out of absolute loyalty to this concept of unbroken succession.
But operating in the shadows has a ceiling. You can only grow so large before the state either crushes you or co-opts you.
And that brings us to the turning point in 313 CE.
The Emperor Constantine issues the Edict of Milan. This is the moment the river dramatically widens, right?
Yes, this single piece of legislation shifts the religion from a persecuted underground movement to a legally recognized, tolerated, and eventually state-sponsored religion.
The psychological and logistical shift of the Edict of Milan, I mean, you can't overstate it.
Imagine spending generations whispering your beliefs in basements, and suddenly the Emperor of Rome is funding the construction of massive public basilicas for your worship.
You move from the margins to the absolute center of imperial power. But with imperial backing comes a brand new massive problem.
Uniformity.
Right. When you are illegal, just surviving is enough to keep you unified. But if you are going to be the spiritual glue of the Roman Empire, you cannot have a fractured belief system.
The emperor needs stability. You can't have a church in Egypt teaching something fundamentally different than a church in Greece.
So this political necessity for uniformity births the era of defining dogma.
The sources highlight 3 critical early councils that were called to hammer out exactly what this religion actually believed.
We have the First Council of Nicaea in 325, the Council of Ephesus in 431, and the Council of Chalcedon in 451.
Right.
Take us into these councils. When we say defining dogma, what is actually happening in these rooms? This isn't just a polite theological seminar, is it?
Not at all. These were high-stakes, intensely political negotiations, often overseen by the emperor himself.
Because the transition from a decentralized group to an imperially recognized body meant they had to write the rule book.
And this is the genesis of canon law. For the listener, canon law is essentially the legal framework created by the church to govern itself and its members.
So at Nicaea and Chalcedon, they debated and fixed the chief dogma of their religion, right?
Yes, the complex belief that Jesus was simultaneously fully God and fully man.
And if you disagreed with the consensus reached at these councils, you weren't just having a theological disagreement anymore.
No, you were a heretic. And because the church was now tied to the Roman state, you were essentially an enemy of imperial unity.
So the stakes became a matter of state security.
Precisely. And alongside defining who Jesus was, these councils began to highly standardize the chief act of worship, the Mass.
We also see the rigid emergence of the clergy as a distinct caste, completely separate from the everyday believers, the laity.
Yes, and this separation included the early localized roots of what would eventually become the universal requirement for clerical celibacy.
So the leaders of the church were to be set apart, unattached to the normal familial and economic ties of the Roman world.
Okay, but I have to look at the practical mechanics of this again. It is one thing to get hundreds of bishops into a room in Nicaea in 325 and get them to sign a document.
Right, agreeing on the dual nature of Christ.
But how do you enforce that? How does a decree signed in a council in the East become the standardized daily practice in a rural village in Gaul or North Africa?
Especially since they don't have a printing press yet to distribute the updated canon law.
The primary vehicle for enforcing this new standardized orthodoxy was an incredibly fascinating movement: monasticism.
Oh, right. Because while the administrative bishops were gathering in wealthy cities, drafting complex legal documents, you had a completely different movement happening simultaneously.
Individuals were retreating into the harshest environments imaginable, specifically the deserts of Egypt.
Sources talk about Egyptian monasticism and severe asceticism.
Yes.
And for the listener, asceticism is the practice of severe self-discipline and the avoidance of all forms of indulgence. You are denying the flesh to elevate the spirit.
We are talking about men and women wearing rough hair shirts, eating barely enough to survive, and living in isolated caves.
The desert fathers and mothers.
Exactly. They were fleeing the newfound wealth and imperial comfort of the church because they felt it was corrupting the original spiritual message.
But ironically, these isolated hermits became the most powerful tool the centralized administration had for standardizing the religion.
Wait, how does a guy living in a cave in Egypt help the Pope in Rome standardize a liturgy in Europe?
Because eventually these hermits form communities, and they adopt strict rules for communal living, like the famous rule of Saint Benedict.
Oh, I see.
These monasteries become self-sustaining economic and spiritual powerhouses. And as they spread from the deserts of Egypt, across the Mediterranean, and up into the furthest reaches of Europe, they act as the circulatory system for the church.
So you have this striking visual contrast. You have the wealthy administrative bureaucracy building palaces in Rome, but the people actually doing the work on the ground are these ascetic monks.
Right. They establish a monastery in the middle of a European forest, and that monastery becomes a node of orthodoxy.
They are the ones physically copying the standardized texts by hand.
They are teaching the local populations the standardized liturgy formulated at Nicaea and Chalcedon.
And because the monks were viewed by the common people as holding immense spiritual authority due to their extreme lifestyles, whatever version of the faith the monks taught was accepted as the absolute truth.
So the bureaucracy in Rome wrote the laws, but the network of ascetic monks actually enforced the cultural transmission.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the next massive geopolitical shift. By the time we reach the year 500, the political landscape of Europe undergoes a catastrophic change.
The Western Roman Empire collapses.
The secular authority that had been protecting and funding the church completely disintegrates. The emperors are gone, the legions are gone.
And this collapse creates a colossal power vacuum in Western Europe. I mean, who is going to fix the roads? Who is going to organize agriculture?
Who provides local law and order?
This marks the beginning of the medieval period, stretching from roughly 500 to 1054. And during this time, the church transforms into what the sources aptly describe as a medieval behemoth.
Because the church was the only institution that survived the fall of Rome with its administrative structure intact.
Right. The network of bishops, the parishes, the monasteries, they were all still functioning while the secular government fell apart.
So the church stepped directly into the void. In the absence of a unified secular government, the local bishop often became the de facto mayor, judge, and economic manager of a city.
And this survival and adaptation translated directly into immense material wealth and unprecedented political dominance.
The sources detail the sheer economic scale of this dominance. The church became the single largest landowner in all of medieval Europe.
But this wealth didn't just come from generous kings donating estates, did it?
No, the church had a highly organized, universally enforced revenue stream called the tithe.
Let's talk about the tithe.
It's a crucial mechanism to understand. It was a mandatory 10% tax on an individual's annual income or agricultural produce.
And this wasn't a suggestion basket passed around on a Sunday.
No, this was a legally enforceable tax system.
Let's visualize how this worked for the average person. Imagine you are a medieval peasant farmer. You harvest your wheat for the year.
Before you feed your family, before you pay your secular feudal lord his share, you must physically transport 1/10 of your entire crop to a massive stone building owned by the church, known as a tithe barn.
And if you didn't pay,
You faced severe spiritual and legal consequences.
so this constant massive influx of grain, livestock, and coinage funded everything.
It funded the construction of the soaring cathedrals that dominated the European skylines. It supported the vast network of monasteries we just discussed, and it financed the early monastic and cathedral schools.
The church essentially had a larger and more reliable tax base than any medieval king.
And if we look at the logistics of this wealth, we have to talk about how deeply integrated the church became with the feudal system.
Because feudalism was the operating system of the Middle Ages, it was a rigid, hierarchical system based entirely on land ownership and military loyalty.
And because the church owned vast tracts of land, they were deeply embedded in this system.
This is where the lines between spiritual leadership and secular power become completely blurred.
A bishop or an abbot wasn't just a pastor tending to souls. Because the church owned the land, the bishop functioned essentially as a feudal lord.
He had peasants working his estates.
He had the right to hold courts of law. In many cases, bishops were required to provide armed knights to the king's army based on the size of their landholdings.
So you have men who are ordained to serve at the altar, but who are also acting as key political advisors, managing massive economic estates, and sometimes even leading troops into battle.
Their religious authority was inextricably linked to their material territorial power.
And the ultimate symbol of this political dominance, the moment that proves the church had become the supreme arbiter of power in Europe, occurred in the year 800.
Right. The sources highlight the coronation of Charlemagne. Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as the Emperor of the Romans.
You really have to look at the political theater of this event. Charlemagne was the most powerful warlord in Europe. He had conquered vast territories.
But he still needed something he couldn't take by force.
Absolute legitimacy.
Exactly. By placing the crown on Charlemagne's head, Pope Leo III established an incredible precedent.
He sent a message to all of Europe that secular power is only valid if it is blessed and bestowed by the spiritual authority of the church.
The Pope possessed the authority to make and theoretically unmake kings.
This dual nature of power is fascinating. On one hand, you have the church providing the only shared identity for a fractured Western Europe.
They're funding education, preserving classical texts in their monasteries, and providing charity when secular institutions fail.
But on the other hand, this immense wealth heavily entangled spiritual leaders in worldly, political, and military disputes.
It created a paradox. The papacy claimed to represent a kingdom not of this world, yet it frequently wielded power that rivaled or exceeded that of secular monarchs.
Think about a modern sovereign state. It has a tax system, it has defined territorial borders, and it conducts foreign policy.
The medieval church operated almost exactly like a massive transnational sovereign state.
The tithe was its tax system. The parishes and dioceses were its local borders. It negotiated treaties and alliances with kings.
It even had its own legal system, canon law, which operated independently of the king's justice.
Given this massive bureaucratic apparatus, how did the average person in the Middle Ages view the Pope? Did they see him as a distant political king in Rome or as a spiritual father?
Well, for the local medieval peasant, the Pope was a pretty abstract concept. Their interaction with the church was intensely local.
Like the parish priest.
Right, the priest who baptized their children or the abbot of the nearby monastery who provided alms during a famine. To them, the church was a spiritual and practical safety net.
But for the aristocracy, for the kings and dukes.
So the aristocracy, the papacy, was undeniably viewed as a supreme, almost imperial authority. And the popes maintained this authority not through standing armies, but through the ultimate spiritual weapon.
Excommunication. Let's break down the mechanics of excommunication, because it acts almost like a medieval nuclear deterrent. What actually happens when a pope excommunicates a king?
Theologically, excommunication means you are cut off from the sacraments of the church, which, in the medieval mindset, meant you were damned to hell.
But politically, it was far more devastating.
If a king was excommunicated by the Pope, the church effectively declared that this king was outside the grace of God. Consequently, all of the oaths of loyalty that the king's vassals had sworn to him were legally null and void.
So if a king steps out of line, the Pope doesn't need to send an army. He just hits the excommunication button.
Suddenly, every ambitious duke, baron, and rival king has a legal and religious justification to rebel, overthrow the king, and seize his lands.
That is the exact mechanism. The threat of excommunication brought powerful emperors to their knees, begging for forgiveness in the snow outside papal residences.
They were spiritual fathers, but they wielded the absolute, unchecked power of kings.
And it is precisely this massive consolidation of supreme autocratic power in the West that directly causes the next catastrophic era.
The very centralization that made the papacy so untouchable in Western Europe ended up deeply alienating the eastern half of the Christian world.
Which brings us to the Great Schism and the Crusades, covering the turbulent period from 1054 to 1204.
The sources provide a highly detailed account of the incident that traditionally marks the beginning of this permanent fracture between the East and the West.
We have a very specific narrative vignette here. The date is Saturday, July 16th, 1054.
The setting is the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, which is the magnificent architectural and spiritual heart of the Eastern Church.
It is an incredibly tense scene. Afternoon prayers are about to begin. The cathedral is filled with the Eastern clergy and the congregation.
And suddenly, Cardinal Humbert, who is the papal legate, the direct representative sent by Pope Leo IX in Rome, strides right into the middle of the cathedral.
He ignores the ongoing liturgy. He walks straight up to the main altar.
He slams a parchment down on the altar.
And that parchment is a formal papal bull excommunicating the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius.
The audacity of the act is staggering. Humbert doesn't try to debate or negotiate. He drops the excommunication, turns around, marches out of the church, symbolically shakes the dust from his shoes to show his contempt, and immediately leaves the city.
And a week later, the Patriarch of Constantinople retaliates by excommunicating the cardinal and the papal delegation in return.
Now, while July 16th, 1054 is the date etched in every history timeline, the sources make it very clear that this dramatic, theatrical incident was not the actual cause of the schism.
Right, you don't split a 1,000-year-old unified religion just because a cardinal threw a tantrum during afternoon prayers.
No, the schism was a slow, agonizing unraveling. The events of 1054 were just the pressure valve blowing off.
The underlying causes had been brewing and compounding for centuries, and they fall into a few distinct categories of friction.
The most foundational issue was a complete breakdown in how each side viewed authority.
Let's examine the Western perspective first. In the West, as we just discussed, the church was centralizing. They were building an autocratic model.
The Pope in Rome asserted that, based on his succession from the Apostle Peter, he had direct, universal, and absolute jurisdiction over the entire global church, both East and West.
But the Eastern perspective, centered in the Byzantine Empire and Constantinople, operated on an entirely different paradigm.
The Byzantines viewed their church structure within the context of the imperial system. For them, ecclesiastical unity and law were not dictated by a single monarchical pope.
Unity was derived from the ecumenical councils, where all the major bishops gathered to vote as relative equals, and from the authority of the Byzantine emperor.
So the East believed their regional patriarchs had always enjoyed autonomy. When the Pope in Rome suddenly claims he can unilaterally dictate policy to Constantinople, the East completely rejects it.
They view it as a tyrannical power grab.
And alongside the political friction over authority, there was intense theological friction, most notably centering on something called the Filioque Clause.
This sounds like obscure theology, but it was a massive geopolitical flashpoint. Let's break down the Filioque Clause. Why did a single Latin word cause a theological meltdown?
It centers on the Christian understanding of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
In the original Nicene Creed, which was agreed upon by both East and West, it stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father.
Yeah.
The Father is the sole ultimate source of the divine.
Right.
However, centuries later, the Western Church in Spain and then Rome added a Latin word to the creed, filioque, which translates to and the Son. So the West began reciting that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son.
To a modern observer, adding "and the Son" might seem like a minor freezing edit. Why did the East react with such absolute fury?
Because, in the Eastern view, changing the fundamental creed of the religion without calling a massive universal council of all bishops was illegal. The Pope, unilaterally changing the text, was proof to the East that Rome was trying to act as a dictator. Furthermore, theologically, the East argued that saying the Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son alters the very nature of God, diminishing the role of the Father as the unoriginate source.
It was a violation of the sacred tradition.
So you have a massive political divide over papal supremacy, a deep theological divide over the Trinity, and then you pile on the practical, everyday disputes that affected how normal people actually worshipped.
Yes, the sources note the intense arguments over the Eucharist. The West insisted on using unleavened bread, while the East fiercely maintained the use of leavened bread, seeing the yeast as a symbol of the resurrected life of Christ.
And then there is the issue of the clergy. The West was rigorously enforcing clerical celibacy, demanding that priests remain unmarried.
While the East had a long-standing tradition of allowing married men to become parish priests.
You have two halves of an empire that are no longer speaking the same language, literally Latin in the West, Greek in the East, and they're no longer listening to each other.
Despite all of this tension and the mutual excommunications of 1054, the two sides were actually still in communication. They still viewed each other as estranged brothers, not complete enemies.
And this brings us to the Crusades.
Right. In 1095, the Byzantine emperor in the east was losing territory to invading Turkish forces. He sent an urgent appeal to the Pope in Rome for military assistance.
And Pope Urban II responds. He calls the First Crusade in 1095. He urges Western knights to march to the east, assist the Byzantines, and ultimately retake the Holy Land.
The motivation here is complex. Urban's call was certainly about reclaiming holy sites, but the sources indicate he was also partially motivated by a desire to bring aid to the Eastern Christians.
It was a massive geopolitical gamble. Perhaps he hoped that shedding blood together against a common enemy would dissipate the ill feelings, heal the schism, and reunite all of Christendom under papal leadership.
It is one of the greatest ironies in history. The Crusades were launched, at least initially, with the ostensible goal of helping the East and reunifying the Christian world.
Instead, the Crusades delivered the fatal, irreversible blow to East-West relations.
The sources detail how the arrival of Western Crusader armies in Byzantine territory backfired spectacularly. The cultural arrogance of the Western Knights clashed immediately with the refined diplomacy of the Byzantines.
But the first real breaking point occurred in 1098 in the city of Antioch.
Antioch was one of the ancient foundational patriarchates of the Eastern Church. What happened when the Western Crusaders captured it?
When the Western Knights took Antioch from Muslim control, they didn't restore the local Greek patriarch to power. Instead, they drove him into exile and forcibly installed a Latin Catholic patriarch in his place.
That is a profound insult. You came to help the East, but the moment you conquer territory, you replace their ancient leadership with a Roman loyalist.
It showed the East that the West wasn't interested in an alliance. They were interested in subjugation.
But the action in Antioch pales in comparison to the ultimate disaster, which occurred during the Fourth Crusade in 1204.
The Fourth Crusade is a masterclass in how a military campaign can completely lose its moral compass.
These Western knights take the Crusader vow. They're supposed to be marching to the Holy Land to fight Muslim armies.
But instead, they get bogged down in debt to Venetian shipbuilders, they get diverted by Byzantine political intrigue, and they end up parked outside the walls of Constantinople.
And then, promised wealth that never materialized, the Western Knights besieged the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire.
They breached the walls and brutally ravaged the city. They slaughtered fellow Christians in the streets. They looted the ancient palaces.
They rode their horses into the cathedral of Hagia Sophia, smashing the altars and stealing the sacred relics to send back to Europe.
How does the Western leadership possibly justify the 1204 sacking of the greatest Christian city in the world?
They couldn't. The sources are clear that this action was not officially sanctioned by the Pope beforehand. In fact, he had expressly forbidden them from attacking fellow Christians.
But once the wealth started flowing back to the West, the protests died down.
The damage on the ground was irreversible. The average Byzantine citizen, who had previously viewed the West with mild suspicion, now learned to absolutely despise the Western Knights.
It was the fires of 1204, the pillaging of their holiest sites by men wearing crosses on their chests, that finally ended all hopes of reunification.
The mutual excommunications of 1054 were a diplomatic spat. The sack of Constantinople was a trauma that the East would never forgive.
The schism was ultimately driven more by political arrogance and military violence than by any debate over the Trinity.
Having witnessed how the Church wielded its military and political reach to devastating effect, we need to shift our focus inward.
During the same medieval period, roughly the 12th through the 15th centuries, the Church was asserting total dominance over the mind of Europe.
We are transitioning from the battlefield to the classroom. This is the era of scholasticism and the birth of the university. And again, we see the Church stepping into a structural vacuum.
During the High Middle Ages, the Church was the sole custodian of Western intellectual life.
The administrative structures we discussed, the vast wealth of the cathedrals and the copying rooms of the monasteries had long maintained local schools for training priests.
But in the 12th century, these local cathedral schools evolved into something entirely new, the first formal universities in human history.
The sources specifically map out this geography of learning. You have the University of Bologna, founded in 1088, focusing heavily on canon law.
You have the University of Paris, established around 1150, which becomes the absolute center of theology.
And you have Oxford in England, These were not secular state colleges. These were ecclesiastical institutions chartered directly by papal decree.
And the dominant intellectual framework taught within these newly formed university walls was called scholastic theology.
To understand how the medieval mind worked, we have to look at the scholastic method. The sources define it as the rigorous, highly systematic attempt to reconcile Christian divine revelation with the logic of classical philosophy.
And the specific philosopher they are trying to reconcile with is Aristotle.
But there is a massive problem here. Aristotle was a pagan Greek who lived centuries before Christ.
His texts were largely lost to the West and were only recently recovered via translations from Arabic scholars in Islamic Spain and the Middle East.
Why is the church suddenly so obsessed with a pagan philosopher?
Because Aristotle provided the most powerful analytical tool the world had ever seen, a complete system of logic, categorization, and empirical observation.
The church realized they couldn't ignore it, so they decided to co-opt it.
They believed that since all truth comes from God, the logical truths of Aristotle must perfectly align with the revealed truths of the Bible.
The intellectual progression of this era is fascinating. The texts highlight key thinkers who built this framework. It starts with Anselm of Canterbury around 1078.
Anselm articulated the foundational concept of scholasticism, faith-seeking understanding.
Anselm's approach was crucial. He wasn't using logic to prove his faith from scratch. He assumed the faith was already true.
He was using logic to deeply explore and systematically explain the mechanics of what he already believed.
But then you get Peter Abelard around 1120, and things get a bit more confrontational. Abelard wrote a famous textbook called Sic et Non, which translates to yes and no. Explain what Abelard did, because it feels incredibly modern.
Abelard used a dialectical method. He compiled a massive list of over 150 theological questions. For each question, he placed quotes from the Bible and earlier church authorities that said yes, right next to quotes from other authorized sources that said no.
He essentially laid bare all the apparent contradictions in church teaching.
He didn't do this to destroy the faith. He did it to force his students to use rigorous reason to resolve the discrepancies.
It is a debate-driven approach to theology. You are forcing the student to find the logical synthesis between two opposing authorities.
And this method culminated in the absolute titan of medieval thought, Thomas Aquinas, working in the 13th century, specifically between 1265 and 1273.
Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologica.
The Summa is almost difficult to comprehend in its scale. It is a massive, multi-volume treatise that structures all of Christian theology around 512 specific questions.
Does God exist? What is the nature of an angel? How does the human will function?
Aquinas synthesized the cold, pagan logic of Aristotle with Christian doctrine so effectively that the church basically adopted his system as its official philosophical framework.
To train the clergy to think like Aquinas, the universities utilized a primary pedagogical tool known as the disputatio. This was a highly formal, public, and structured debate.
Think about how you were taught to write an essay in school today. You're told to present a thesis, then immediately bring up counter-arguments, and then systematically dismantle those counter-arguments to draw your conclusion.
When you do that, you are essentially using the exact blueprint of the disputatio invented by these medieval monks.
During a disputatio, a master would pose a thesis. The students would raise the strongest possible objections to it.
The master would then have to systematically reply to every single objection using precise Aristotelian logic and authorized texts.
They were essentially building an impenetrable intellectual fortress around the doctrines of the church.
If we look at the unintended consequences of this, I have to point out a severe risk. By taking divine, transcendent mysteries, things that earlier generations just accepted on pure faith, and subjecting them to this incredibly rigid Aristotelian logic, isn't the church inadvertently planting the seeds for rationalism?
How do you mean?
Well, if you train generations of the brightest minds in Europe that every single aspect of faith must be logically defended against intense systematic scrutiny, aren't you providing the very tools for radical doubt? You are teaching people to demand proof.
That is a highly perceptive reading of the historical trajectory. The scholastics were absolutely convinced that reason and faith would always harmonize.
But they elevated human reason to such an exalted status that, centuries later, during the Enlightenment, secular philosophers would take those exact same logical tools forged in the medieval universities and use them to dismantle the foundational premises of the faith itself.
The church sharpened the blade of reason. assuming it would only ever be used to defend the walls, never realizing it could be turned against them.
And the unraveling of that medieval consensus brings us directly into the 16th century. We transition from the intellectual heights of the High Middle Ages into an era of catastrophic fracture.
Because all the elements we have discussed so far, the massive, uncheckable wealth of the tithe, the deep political entanglement with kings and feudalism, the rigid, highly centralized bureaucracy in Rome, created a breeding ground for systemic corruption.
The sheer size and wealth of the institution made it impossible to manage without profound compromise.
And this leads directly to the shattering of the church during the Protestant Reformation and the aggressive, sweeping countermeasures the church had to invent to survive.
The unity of papal Christendom had been slowly undermined by shifting social and economic forces. But the decisive blow, the spark that ignited the powder keg, came in 1517.
The sources highlight an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther, who publicly challenged papal authority.
But Luther didn't just wake up one day and decide to invent a new theology. His protests were fueled by intense anger over specific, widespread abuses within the church hierarchy.
To understand the Reformation, we have to look mechanically at what was actually happening on the ground. The texts list the specific abuses explicitly. First, there was simony.
Let's break simony down. What did this look like economically?
Simony is the buying and selling of church offices. Imagine a powerful, wealthy, aristocratic family in the 16th century. They have a second or third son who isn't going to inherit the secular family estate.
They need him to have a prestigious, high-income career.
So the family literally purchases a bishopric for him from the papal bureaucracy in Rome.
So he becomes a bishop not because he is a pious spiritual leader, but because his family engaged in a financial transaction with the Pope.
Exactly. And that office comes with massive tracts of land, it comes with political power, and crucially, it comes with the right to collect the tithe from the local peasants. It is a guaranteed revenue stream.
And that inevitably leads to the next abuse on the list, which is pluralism. Because if one bishopric is a good revenue stream, why stop there?
Pluralism is the practice of a single aristocrat purchasing and holding multiple dioceses simultaneously. You might be the bishop of a city in Germany, a city in France, and a city in Italy, all at the same time.
Which brings us to absenteeism, because humanly, you cannot physically manage 3 dioceses in 3 different countries.
So the bishop simply never visits them. He sits in a comfortable palace in Rome or Paris, collecting the massive tax revenues from peasants in a German diocese he has never set foot in.
He hires a desperately poor, uneducated substitute priest to actually perform the local mass and handle the day-to-day work.
So the local population is being heavily taxed by a distant, wealthy lord they never see, and in return, they receive terrible spiritual care from an illiterate substitute.
You can see why the local populations were furious. And that leads to the most famous abuse, the one that broke Luther, the sale of indulgences.
The indulgence trade is where the theology and the economics clashed most violently. Theologically, an indulgence was a remission of the punishment due for sin.
The idea was that the church had a treasury of merit built up by Christ and the saints, and the Pope could dispense this merit to believers to shorten their time in purgatory.
But the theory morphed into a predatory financial instrument. The papacy needed vast sums of money to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome.
So they authorized preachers to go into Germany and literally sell these indulgences.
The emotional reality of this was devastating. You had poor peasants who were terrified of hell, terrified for the souls of their deceased parents, and aggressive preachers were telling them that for a few coins, they could buy their loved ones out of purgatory.
When you look at the economics, Martin Luther in 1517 doesn't just look like a theologian arguing about Scripture. He looks like a man pointing at a fundamentally broken, exploitative tax system and demanding accountability.
Luther's denial of absolute papal authority caused much of the elaborate medieval structure to completely collapse in Northern Europe.
The resulting division of Europe wasn't just a peaceful parting of ways. It led to a century of devastating geopolitical conflicts culminating in the 30 Years' War, as nations chose sides and slaughtered each other over the divide between Catholicism and the new Protestant denominations.
The Church of Rome faced an absolute existential crisis. Millions of members were gone. Entire nations had defected.
To survive, the papacy had to initiate a thoroughgoing, ruthless reform of its own institutions. This effort was heavily centered on the Council of Trent, which convened between 1545 and 1563.
The Council of Trent was the defining event of what is historically known as the Catholic Counter-Reformation. But looking at the timeline, it was a logistical nightmare. It lasted 18 years.
18 years. Think about trying to hold a legislative session together for nearly 2 decades.
The sources note it spanned the reigns of 5 different popes: Paul III, Julius III, Marcellus II, Paul IV, and Pius IV.
It was constantly interrupted by plagues, by wars between the kings of France and the Holy Roman Emperor, and by political infighting.
But when they did finally manage to pass decrees, the results fundamentally reshaped the institution. On matters of doctrine, Trent refused to give an inch to the Protestants.
They drew a sharp, immovable line of demarcation in the sand. Luther had proclaimed the doctrine of Scripture alone, that the Bible was the only source of authority. How did Trent respond?
Trent aggressively affirmed that sacred historical tradition was equally necessary and carried the same divine weight as Scripture. The Bible was only part of the equation. The historic teachings of the Church were the other half.
Luther also championed justification by faith alone.
Against that, Trent explicitly defined that justification required faith, yes, but it also required hope, and charity expressed through active good works. They reaffirmed the divine validity of all 7 sacraments.
And they doubled down on the Eucharist. They officially dogmatized transubstantiation. Let's explain this concept because it was a major dividing line. They weren't just saying the bread and wine symbolized Jesus, were they?
No, they were using precise Aristotelian philosophy to assert that while the accidents, the physical appearance, taste, and texture of the bread and wine remain identical, the underlying substance or fundamental reality of the objects literally changes into the body and blood of Christ.
They also reaffirmed the sacrificial character of the Mass and the hierarchical, sacred nature of the ordained priesthood. They conceded absolutely nothing on theology.
However, while they refused to change the theology, they recognized the desperate need to fix the corrupt bureaucracy. They engaged in sweeping disciplinary reform.
First and foremost, they strictly banned the sale of indulgences. The theological concept remained, but attaching a financial transaction to it was outlawed.
They also implemented strict new rules for the daily lives of the laity, particularly concerning marriage.
Before Trent, clandestine marriages were a huge social problem. 2 people can just privately exchange vows and be considered married, which led to endless legal disputes over inheritance and bigamy.
Trent mandated that for a Catholic marriage to be valid, it had to be performed in the presence of a priest and 2 witnesses, and it had to be publicly registered.
They also maintained an absolute ban on divorce, even for innocent parties in cases of infidelity.
Crucially, to combat the profound clerical ignorance and the absenteeism we discussed earlier, Trent mandated a massive structural change: the establishment of seminaries.
This is huge. Before this, priest training was essentially an apprenticeship. Now, Trent dictates that every diocese must build a dedicated, standardized school to properly educate and train its priests in theology, Latin, and pastoral care.
They asserted strict autocratic control to enforce all of this. The Pope was placed firmly at the top of an unquestionable hierarchy, and bishops were given absolute control over their respective dioceses.
The era of laymen or secular kings having a say in church administration was officially over.
The Council of Trent also tackled something that seems entirely scientific but had massive religious implications: time itself. In 1582, following the mandates of Trent, Pope Gregory XIII reforms the Julian calendar.
The Julian calendar, which Europe had been using since the days of Julius Caesar, had a mathematical flaw. It miscalculated the solar year.
Over 16 centuries, that tiny error compounded. By the late 16th century, the calendar was out of sync with the actual solar equinox by 10 full days.
Why does the church care if the calendar is drifting?
Because of Easter. The entire liturgical year is anchored to Easter, which is calculated based on the spring equinox. If the calendar drifts, you're celebrating the most important theological event of the year on the wrong cosmic day.
So how do they fix it mechanically?
Gregory XIII implements the Gregorian calendar. The mathematical fix is to reduce the number of leap years. Instead of 100 leap years every 4 centuries, you only have 97.
But to fix the drift, they literally had to delete 10 days from history. In October 1582, people went to sleep on Thursday, October 4th, and when they woke up the next morning, it was legally Friday, October 15th.
Imagine the panic. You have rent due, you have agricultural contracts, and the Pope just vanished 10 days of your life.
It shows the sheer autocratic power the papacy had consolidated. They had the power to redefine time.
Alongside the bureaucracy, what is notable here is the emergence of new religious orders designed to actively implement these reforms and push back against Protestantism. The most significant of these was the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, founded by Ignatius of Loyola in 1534.
The Jesuits functioned almost as the intellectual special forces for the papacy. They were rigorously educated, highly disciplined, and completely loyal to the Pope.
While the bureaucracy managed Europe, the Jesuits led massive global missionary works. Figures like Francis Xavier took the Catholic faith to India and Japan, effectively compensating overseas for the territorial and demographic losses the Church had suffered in Europe.
But I want to pause and look at how historians frame this era. The term Counter-Reformation implies that everything Trent did was merely a panicked defensive reaction to Luther.
But if we look at the actual outcomes in the establishment of standardized seminaries, the precise codification of marriage law, the global coordination of missionaries, does the evidence suggest that Trent was actually a highly successful, long overdue modernization of the Church's machinery?
That is a critical evaluation. The sources note that Trent bequeathed to Catholics a highly authoritarian, centralized structure that was fundamentally medieval in its theology, yet distinctly modern in its organizational efficiency.
Trent transformed the Church into a rigorous, disciplined institution. It lost geographical territory to the Protestants, but it gained immense internal spiritual focus. It created a unified global entity capable of projecting power well beyond the borders of Europe.
Which sets the stage perfectly for our final section, the modern crucible, covering the 18th century to the present day. We have this rigid, authoritarian, highly centralized institution forged in the fires of Trent. Now we get to watch it navigate the total upheaval of the Enlightenment, global modernism, and contemporary society.
During the centuries following Trent, the Church essentially built a fortress. It set itself with grim determination against almost all the trends of modern secular culture. The sources highlight the severe shock of the French Revolution in 1789.
The French Revolution wasn't just a political overthrow of a king, it was an existential threat to the Church. It brought intense, violent de-Christianization.
Churches were seized, priests were executed or forced to swear loyalty to the secular state, and the property of the Church was nationalized.
In response to this trauma, and to the rising forces of rationalism, liberalism, and democracy across Europe throughout the 19th century, the Church adopted an incredibly defensive posture. They viewed the modern world as a hostile territory.
This defensive posture peaked at the First Vatican Council, held between 1869 and 1870. Vatican essentially doubled down on the absolute, centralized authority that was established at Trent. The Council formally declared the dogma of papal infallibility.
We need to define the mechanics of papal infallibility because it is often misunderstood. It does not mean the Pope is incapable of sinning or that every single thing he says is correct.
The dogma states that when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, which means from the chair of Peter, acting in his supreme official capacity, and explicitly defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole Church, he is protected by the Holy Spirit from error.
It was the ultimate assertion of top-down authority. The world is secularizing, kings are losing their thrones to parliaments, and the Church responds by declaring its monarch possesses absolute infallible authority. They were building the walls of the fortress higher.
But then, less than a century later, we witness one of the most monumental institutional shifts in history. Between 1962 and 1965, the Church holds the Second Vatican Council.
The contrast between Vatican I and Vatican II is jarring. Vatican I was about building a wall against the world. Vatican II, called by Pope John XXIII, aimed to throw open the windows to the modern world.
They realized that the defensive posture of Trent was no longer viable in the 20th century.
The theological shifts at Vatican II were profound. The Council produced several major documents, but the Constitution Dei Verbum was revolutionary. It completely redefined the Church's understanding of divine revelation.
How so? Since Trent, revelation was viewed as the transmission of fixed, static concepts. Here are the rules, memorize them, obey them.
Exactly. But Dei Verbum framed revelation not just as a list of propositions, but as a historical dialogue. It described revelation as a personal self-disclosure by God to humanity in history.
This shift allowed for a much more nuanced, historical, and less rigid approach to theology and biblical studies.
But the average Catholic in the pews didn't read the dense theological documents. They experienced Vatican II through massive, immediate, practical changes.
For 400 years, since the Council of Trent, the Mass had been standardized in Latin worldwide. Whether you were in Paris, Tokyo, or Buenos Aires, the priest faced away from the congregation and spoke a language that people didn't understand.
Vatican II changed that overnight. It allowed the Mass to be celebrated in the local vernacular languages. It turned the priest around to face the people.
It vastly increased the active participation of the laity in the liturgy, recognizing that the church was not just the clergy, but the entire people of God.
It also fundamentally changed how the church interacted with the outside world. It opened ecumenical dialogues with other Christian denominations, moving away from the Tridentine view that everyone else was simply a heretic.
Notably, this outward shift led to a historic diplomatic moment in 1965.
Yes, in 1965, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras of Constantinople met and mutually lifted the excommunications that had been hurled back in 1054.
They didn't resolve all the theological differences, but they formally erased the anathemas that had caused the Great Schism. They shifted from hostility to dialogue.
Today, the contemporary church navigates an incredibly complex landscape. The sources report a global membership of over 1.4 billion people.
But demographically, the center of gravity has radically shifted. It has moved away from its historical base in Europe. Today, the vast majority of the Catholic population is heavily concentrated in Latin America, Africa, and Asia.
And alongside managing this massive demographic shift, the modern institution has faced severe systemic crises.
Most notably, the devastating global revelations of clerical sex abuse cases and the institutional cover-ups that followed have shattered the moral authority of the hierarchy in many parts of the world, forcing agonizing internal scrutiny and massive reform efforts regarding accountability.
We have seen recent leadership navigating these extreme tensions. Popes like Benedict XVI, who leaned toward emphasizing traditional doctrine, Francis, who has pushed for pastoral openness and decentralization, and, according to the timeline provided in our sources, Leo XIV.
But observing this modern landscape raises a fundamental question about the institution's mechanics.
What is the question?
How does an institution that explicitly claims its core doctrines are eternally valid, handed down directly from Christ to Peter, managed to fundamentally alter its approach to the world, like the whiplash shift from the rigid defensive posture of Trent to the open dialogical posture of Vatican II, without completely alienating its traditional base?
That is the defining tension within the modern church. It is a constant, delicate, high-wire act.
They are attempting to balance the strict traditionalism and fixed doctrines inherited from the Middle Ages and the Council of Trent, with the pastoral, inclusive approach initiated by the Second Vatican Council.
The institutional challenge is claiming absolute, unbroken continuity with the past, while simultaneously adapting to unprecedented historical and cultural changes in the present.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to consider. We have traced a very distinct, cyclical historical pattern today.
Immense crises forced the church to change. The fall of the Roman Empire forced it to step into secular administration. The Great Schism and the Protestant Reformation forced it to aggressively centralize its power at Trent. The secularization of the 20th century forced it to open up at Vatican II.
The institution survives by oscillating between centralization and decentralization, driven by the pressures of the era.
Exactly. So, considering the massive demographic shift happening right now, with the vast majority of the faithful living in the global south, how will this pressure force a new interpretation of the rigid, Eurocentric bureaucratic structures that were defined centuries ago?
As the population in Africa and Asia continues to explode while European attendance plummets, will we see a future where the Church's intellectual, cultural, and perhaps even administrative heart officially leaves Rome for a new global center?
Something for you to mull over as you think about how institutions evolve.
It is a dynamic question. It reminds us that we have to look at this 2,000-year history not as a closed book of static facts, but as an ongoing, highly adaptable process of institutional evolution.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.